Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. We are looking at Frankenstein, and this is the last part of the second edition that we're going to be talking about. We've also decided that this is going to be the final meetup on Frankenstein. So the first part of the meetup is going to be about these last chapters. And once we're done with that, we will put on the table the question, what did you get from reading of Frankenstein? How would you compare the two editions? Anything that you want to share about Frankenstein as a whole? So those are the two things. We're going to start with Joe reading CJ's notes. CJ couldn't make it today, but he has sent his rough notes. These are not the fair notes, but rough notes about this last part to Joe and me. So Joe is going to read that out, and then I want to invite anybody else who would like to share their comments on this final chapters. Joe.
So these are CJ's synopsis from the last part of the book. It says, notes from my unwritten synopsis. The art of interpretation. Every time I reread a book, whether fiction or nonfiction, different passages and phrases excite for me new things to consider, and I rearrange how I reconsider them, how I interpret them. Interpretation is a dynamic process where the author's text provides the context for the reader's own imaginative, interpretive faculty. It is a wonderfully creative process that I think we can all engage with more conscientiously and effectively to add dimensions to our reading and life experience. I was struck by two seemingly significant interpretations in this final quarter of the novel. First, Victor's speech against ambition echoes, for me, the earlier passage in the first quarter of the novel where Mary Shelley highlights how the mad scientist ignored his domestic obligations. It seems to me that Shelley is deeply critiquing our culture's pathological male tendency for overambition, which ignores the full scope of living a human life. Secondly, Victor's reminder that pursuing the secret of life is madness is reinforced here at the end, emphasizing the interpretation of the novel as being about the folly of our ambition to transcend nature's role and women's role as being the rightful creators of new life. It is a conceit that I do not necessarily share, but it is the story of Dante's Commedia and many other stories in our cultural heritage. It is an important consideration and warning for humanity's tendency to transcendent ambition. Many other interpretations are possible. I wondered what kind of novel would end less bleakly by engaging Victor and his creature, finding a way to work together to restore the harmonic balances of nature. Clearly, Shelley did not have such a thought in mind for her novel. But as creative interpreters, we can take the novel in directions that the author never intended. Such creative engagement with our culture and civilization is the stuff that creates new possibilities for our lives and our society. The art of interpretation is an important tool for this culturally creative genesis. Mary Shelley's masterpiece provides the attentive reader with many byways and main ways to exercise their creative art of interpretation. I hoped everyone enjoyed reading this novel twice with some efforts to further engage your art of interpretation.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are his takeaways.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Anybody else wants to share their takeaways for these last chapters? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Doug, would you like to start first?
Yeah, I was thinking about this now, although I'm And I've been listening to a reading of this edition, and I guess I'm about 30 minutes from the end of the novel. So I read the novel and listen to it and read it, and different things come out. There are two things that struck me, which I've touched on before, but they strike me as really powerful, is the kind of manic depressive energy that's in the prose, where it suddenly is cheerful and then suddenly depressed and then suddenly angry and then suddenly the turning on a dime kind of shifts in tone and emotion, which is very Shakespearean. I mean, the Greeks sort of do it too, but the translations are so bad of the Greeks that we don't see the humor often in the Greeks, in the original Greeks. A few translators touch on that, but that kind of ability, I mean, so much so as over the decades as I've thought about that, I've actually thought about the tragic and comic masks as being representative not just of here's a happy play, here's a sad play, but the fact that what you see in the Gita and different things and other literature, that there are these extremes of emotion, and then you have to find a balance point between them. So I began to think that the tragic mask and the comic mask are sort of the roller coaster, represent the roller coaster we ride on, and that certainly in modern times, a comedy or a tragedy, often a good comedy has very serious dramatic values, and a good tragedy is often very funny. There's sort of electric energy, like at a car crash, where people are almost giddy from the electricity of the tragic event. I mean, it's tragic and it's depressing, but there's also this sort of electricity. And it seems like she really that she could represent that at 19 years old and maybe even soften it or refine it or do or go further with it. I don't know how to compare the two, except the most obvious ones are in Elizabeth. And I had someone who I thought might come to the last event who teaches Frankenstein many times at high-end high schools, where
Mm.
she has high school students read Frankenstein. And so she knows both editions very well, and she likes the first one. But this idea that I agree with CJ completely, and we've talked about this over the years, and it deepens every time I read it, is that she grew up with this amazing father, and I'm reading the very end of it and listening to the very end of it, and it's like Walton and Frankenstein are falling all over each other, telling each other how wonderful they are, which Mary Shelley must have grown up with a father talking about how wonderful some writer was, and then Shelley and Lord Byron, who loved her father and thought he was the greatest thing since, I don't know, sliced bread, which didn't exist at that time, but whatever. I mean, it's like that, and that Byron probably praised Shelley, and Shelley praised Byron, and you're great, no, you're great, and we're doing a wonderful adventure, and she is this little girl growing up in this world of people who don't know how to run a household and have to marry someone that usually doesn't get along with Mary Shelley because they need somebody to run their house. I mean, her father, because he couldn't do it himself. So these sort of impractical men, and Shelley himself, who probably was a sailor, but he drowns at sea in a sea storm. I mean, there's a certain kind of on some level, you wonder how competent are these men for certain tasks even though they're geniuses. And so she seems to understand the nature of genius and how full of foibles it is, And that really strikes me. And that growing up in that, she must have gone through these mood swings of, oh, I'm happy, they're happy. And then, well, they're not happy, so I'm not happy. And what's really going on? So there's the turmoil of the emotional, which the romantics focused on, the storm and stress, the Sturm
Mm.
and Drang, the kind of nature of life. And the stress could be really exciting, but then suddenly it's like they're thrown into hell. No, you're in heaven. No, you're in hell. You're in heaven. It's sort of a Jekyll and Hyde thing of oppositions. And, Jekyll is sort of the handsome, beautiful, responsible doctor, but really he's a shriveled little powerful maniac, and that's the part of him that comes out. It's not the drug that makes him crazy. The drug releases something that was inside of him. The other interesting thing is the death element at the end and how it converges with the wedding. And when I was working on the Oedipus trilogy and Antigone is killed just before her wedding, I was working on that project and I went to lunch at a market, a high-end kind of market at the other end of the mall. Well, not high-end, but a nice market. And they had a shelf of wedding magazines and they were all in white dresses. And I suddenly realized brides dress like ghosts. And then I began to research it. They wear white and it's sort of very ghostly. And I was staring at all these white dresses on the magazine shelf and I'm going, and then I began to research the anthropological roots of it. And the woman dies to her father to be married into a new life with her husband. That's a very common thing in many cultures. And so this schizophrenic thing that she's writing about this man's fear about his wedding, that he's going to die. And he doesn't even think that his wife is going to die, which shows how stupid he is because he's just killed the monster's wife. But that sort of inability to see through to the solution, but in a way, marriage is almost synonymous with death. And people do lose, they gain a partner, but they lose part of themselves to the marriage, and the partner loses part of themselves to the marriage, and the marriage is almost like a third partner in the whole thing. But the fact that his dread of death actually leads to his new wife's death, and that it's all being written by a woman who sort of, by a daughter of a feminist who's aware of the complexity of marriage. And so it strikes me as that she takes a certain psychological fear of getting married, which men and women can feel, and extrapolates it into this monstrous fairy tale science fiction, piece. It's amazing that at 19 years old, she could sort of know enough about those emotional swings to write about this. And I guess that's it. That's sort of
That was beautiful, beautiful.
the storm of emotions. It never ceases to amaze me. And how much it's like the heights of beauty of a mountain. And look at that mountain. It's so beautiful. And then I got very terrified because the monster might be lurking in those mountains. And, and nature is very dangerous, but it's very beautiful. So it's totally manic depressive sort of schizophrenic world that she's writing with. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Doug. Next up is Allison.
Yeah, so when I first started reading this, I just kept thinking it's about, creating this monster and, all of that. And then the more, as we kept going back into it, the thing that really, really struck me was that I felt like Frankenstein completely took advantage of his fiancée, just completely. And the thing that the part of the equation that's not written into the book, but it's very real, is that for these women, marriage wasn't really about love. If they were lucky, they got love along with it. Marriage was about financial security. They had zero way of supporting themselves, none. And if they didn't get married, they just get sponged off to a brother or an uncle and, hope for the best. But they had literally no way of supporting themselves. And the thing is, the reality is this is true until 1974 in this country, when women earned the right to have credit, because you couldn't own a house. You couldn't have a credit card. You couldn't, So really all the way up until very recently in history, women needed a husband to survive. And for these women, it wasn't even just that they needed a husband. They had to do it while they were in their childbearing years, because if they didn't, nobody would want them after that. So they served one purpose, is to produce children, and that was it, really. And so all of these books, I'll be honest, when I was younger, I had this phase of reading all the Jane Eyre and all the stuff and all of the Sense and Sensibility. And then I reached a point where I got really sick of it, because all they did was talk about marriage. And that, to me, it wasn't that interesting. So my two favorite authors are Hemingway and Dostoevsky, because they had adventures and they were exciting. And I just wanted to be them and live a full life that included marriage, but had other things. But now, as I kind of come back to it, what I realize is for him to go gallivanting around having all these adventures, and he keeps telling her, yeah, I'm going to marry you, yeah, I'm going to marry. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking, and her valuable years to secure any kind of financial future are disappearing rapidly. And while he's, oh, I don't know if I want that, blah, 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 you know, she was trapped waiting for him. And I feel like so often in these books, it's kind of like dismissed, like that's not a big issue, but it is an issue. It's a massive issue. And even today, when women have more choices, they still have about 10 years, 22 to 32, to find someone to have a family with if they want that. And the thing is, I'm not saying that I really believe not everybody's suited to marriage and not everyone is suited for parenthood. I 100% believe that. But I think the important thing is that people need to be honest about it. You know, they need to be honest. And if a man is just, I just want to play around, okay, then you know what? In both Frankenstein and here, they would have made different decisions, but they told the women what they wanted to hear because they kind of wanted them in their back pocket while they're doing whatever they're doing. And they wanted, to have their cake and eat it too. And it was profoundly unfair. And I feel like, and again, like, I don't think that I understand, like what Doug was saying about this, you don't want to lose yourself in a marriage. And I get that it's not for everyone. I mean, personally, I have this theory that I think pretty much everybody that's 40 or above who has not married or has children, they don't actually want it. And then they've made decisions to ensure that it doesn't happen. That's my actual theory. But I think the thing is, though, what is so wrong is what they're doing to these women, and then I think, and I say it as a woman, but I say it also as a teacher, because I teach children without fathers all day, every year for 20 years. And it has disastrous effects on the women and the children. But the other thing with it that I think that the way that this is written is it's showing what happens to Frankenstein after all of these things, that there he is constantly chasing him constantly, and he's alone. He's always alone. And Philip said something really good in Faust the other day, where he said that you've got these two choices and both choices have consequences, and neither one is necessarily a good choice or a bad choice, but every action comes with a consequence. So I think what she's doing in here, Mary Shelley, is really showing the consequence of what Frankenstein does, not just the consequences to his wife, his friend, this family, but the consequences to himself, and that he's living with that loneliness. And I feel like his anger at the monster isn't really the anger at the monster. He's angry at himself because he did this to himself. And every step along the way, he could have been a better father to this creature. He could have gone back home. He could have made the creature a wife. He could have done a million things, but in every case, every single choice he had, it was his ego that took over. And he just cared more about the ego. And, it's like Don Quixote, jousting with the windmill. It's just this ego becomes more important than anything else in the world. And so I think, it's important that these books are written, because they're trying to show what happens with this. But those are just my basic thoughts with that. Really.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alison. Just incredible observations. Thank you. Next up is going to be Madeline, followed by Joe. Madeline.
Well, I've thought a bit about time in this novel and how it's conveyed, how the passage of time is conveyed. So I'm going to just start very small and in some detail, and then look at the bigger picture. So we have Frankenstein. He's out on the ice, or he's just about to go out onto the ice. And in one sentence, he says, I exchanged my land sledge for one fashioned for the inequalities of the frozen ocean, and purchasing a plentiful stock of provisions, I departed from land. So that's probably a substantial amount of time and bustling around that got condensed into one sentence. And I think it was admirably done, because it's possible that, Shelley's knowledge of exactly how to provision an ice sledge for the ocean was a little bit unclear. And then the next few paragraphs, next couple of paragraphs, get into two different kinds of time. One is an uncertain time. I cannot guess how many days have passed since then, because there's really no seasons up there. It's just ice and, you know, the thunder of cracking ice and all of that, and clouds and snow. But then he's in the next paragraph, he starts, by the quantity of provision which I had consumed, I should guess that I had passed 3 weeks in this journey. So now time is measured by food, by how much food he's consumed and how much he has left. Then suddenly we're back more in real time. He's taken the dead dog off the sledge and fed the dogs, and then he says, after an hour's rest. So now he's back into clock time again. So just in those 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, there's a lot of movement between different types of time. I had also noticed that there's the part where he's in the Irish jail. The magistrate is there. And now he's recovering. The magistrate says, I found several letters, and among others, one which I discovered from its commencement to be from your father. I instantly wrote to Geneva. Nearly 2 months have elapsed since the departure of my letter. So now Victor is getting kind of anchored in time again. He knows he's been there at least 2 months. So first he tells him that he's written to the father. Then he gives him news of the family. Then he says, but where is my father? And then Mr. Kerwin rose and quitted the room with my nurse, and in a moment my father entered it. So we go from a letter taking 2 months to reach the father into sort of exposition time of what is happening with his family and how he feels upon the news. And then suddenly his father's there. And it does sort of echo what it's like to be delirious. You get these sort of stops and starts and lurches of time. So now I'm going to look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that at the end of Frankenstein's narrative, now we have another letter. This one is from Robert Walton to his sister, Mrs. Margaret Saville. And it starts, you have read this strange and terrific story, Margaret. So suddenly we realize that everything that we have just heard, which is the vast bulk of the book, is an enclosure with a single letter. I think it was the one, and it's actually an enclosure with a letter, the last letter from the beginning, letter number 4, which ends, it ends that he's going to work on the manuscript. Okay. So now here we are. He's enclosed the entire manuscript with a letter. And really, we are reading over Margaret's shoulder the entire time. And although he says that, Walton says, you know, the letters of Felix and Safie brought the story credibility, I think also the epistolary form brings a credibility. Because now you have multiple accounts within multiple accounts by various witnesses. And each one has an eyewitness flavor. Obviously, they're all biased, but they're fairly straightforward. So each one of these has an eyewitness flavor. And it was basically the equivalent of, I don't know, one of those novels you read where it's, the whole thing is texts and emails and tweets and things, and transcripts of voicemails. So all of these letters took time to be delivered. As each one is mailed, Walton never knows if his sister is going to read it or not. But we have to presume that she has received at least the fourth one. Otherwise, because we're sitting here reading the book, otherwise we would still be on shipboard. You know, the book would be ending with him writing something like, "Dearest Margaret, I will never see you again. The ship is sinking now." And, you know, the letters are burning in fire or something. And so we would be left with that. But instead, we're returned back to civilization. We're the people who the adventurers are writing to, reading these letters, sitting in our armchairs.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up, we're going to have Ed, followed by Joe. Ed, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, guys. Working on a bit of general knowledge on Frankenstein rather than specifics. So, looking at the issue of basically of fatherhood, which was raised earlier, you've got Frankenstein as a technological riff on the Jewish Golem story. And if you accept that a man's purpose is creating an environment where women and children can flourish, then Frankenstein effectively creates a child with no concern whatever for the environment or any concern whatever for the consequences of his actions, which makes a very good cautionary tale about the even then increasing power of our technological ability and the risks that such behavior entails, which has only gotten more relevant in the century or so since.
Excellent point. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, for me, you know, I look at this as, again, and I've said this in the past, as it's Victor's, you know, complete disregard for everyone around him. And I think Allison actually hit on something that was very, very important in her, one of her takeaways when she was talking about, was it isolation, essentially, that you were talking about. You know, I look at two people that are isolated in this novel, and it's Frankenstein and Victor. I mean, the creature and Victor. And in the sense that, you know, Victor is become lost in his way and so obsessed with creating, you know, creating Frankenstein, that he never really thinks about the consequences. And what's more is that he never really, he becomes more about himself. It's always, as Allison had put it, his ego kind of takes over at every step of the way. His inability to be honest with anybody that are around him, with the risks that, you know, that the risks of that they're in because of his actions. But I also see the creature as somebody that's been isolated as well, and he's been rejected by society. And in a sense, he becomes vengeful. And so that there's these two people that they're both been isolated, one by choice and the other by society. And they both have negative reactions overall. And I think that that's one of the major themes of overall to the book that I've kind of taken away more than anything. I think his, I also, just as far as this aspect, this ending part of the book that we're covering, and this had come up again every time I listen to two versions now. And what really strikes me is the difference in how Justine was actually treated in her accusation and her trial, and how Victor was actually in his accusations and his trial. It was that is a interesting difference to see how the class structure of, and there was a certain arrogance that had Victor almost saying to himself that he knew he was going to be acquitted, that he was never in any real danger. And that you know, that's something that was striking to me the first time, and striking to me as well the second time, is that you know, he knows that he's not going to be convicted of Clerval's murder. And that's I think that that's important. There's I mean, there's a couple of others of overall themes that maybe we could talk about as our general takeaways, like, you know, ambition and revenge and things along those lines, but we'll come to those. Those are more general statements that I want to come to afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. So now let's move on to our take on the novel itself, because this is going to be the last meetup in this series. CJ has proposed a bunch of questions. So here are some of his questions. But feel free to talk in general about your general take on Frankenstein, your comparisons between the two versions that we read. If you have read Frankenstein many years ago and are rereading it, what is your reaction now as compared to then? Anything that you want. So here are the proposed questions that CJ wants to put on the table. What set of considerations did you organize into one or several interpretations of this novel? What occurred to you as considerations to put together in your rereading of Frankenstein? Did rereading of the novel evoke different reflections, different interpretations? Did the 1818 edition evoke different interpretations from the 1831 edition? So these are more about the editions, but would love to hear what you see. What is your take on the novel as a whole? There are several points that people have made. Some of them you can feel free to repeat them or elaborate on them. Would love to hear what you got from Frankenstein. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to share, or raise your hand in Zoom. As nobody has typed anything yet, I'm going to go ahead and quickly summarize what everybody has said. Not summarize, I'm just going to highlight a few points. Doug talked about it being comedy and tragedy. You know, this moving between that, the emotional quality, almost like a continuously shifting between emotions, intense emotions. He talked about marriage as death and the fear of that. He talked about, then Allison talked in detail about the role of women here, and how, what kind of a role it is as a background for that. Then it was on responsibility versus ego. This is a theme that keeps coming up, of, you know, the Frankenstein being focused on his own ego and not taking responsibility. I think responsibility or irresponsibility is a big theme. Madeline talked about the time measurements. The point that came up last time was the attitude towards the other, the fact that somebody is very different from you, what is there, and how it shapes how you view them, how others view them, as well as how they view themselves and how they interact with one another. Joe brought about the point about isolation and consequences of that. Ed talked about the technological power and the responsibility of using it. These are some of the points that we've brought up, but please go ahead. We're going to start with Joe, followed by Doug. Joe.
Yeah, one of the things that I'll just mention again, I guess the development of the creature, and in the sense that, he begins with a warm heart and just wanting to be loved and seeking to be loved. And he turns into this monster. And meaning monster, when I say that in the sense that the acts that he commits. And the part that still strikes me is that when he saw the DeLacy family, and he started to understand what it meant to be loved, what it meant to be a family, what all these concepts that society that he was missing out on. And, he then develops these desires from that. And I think that that's how we develop our desires. We start to idealize things, right? We start to see what other people have. And then we start to think about, well, I don't have that. And he, becomes profoundly sad, and then even speaks to Frankenstein about that. And Frankenstein's initial response to him is, before that is, he didn't want to listen to him. But he convinced him that a spouse would be in his best interest. And I think that that's, to me, one of the more powerful things, because he goes from this wanting to be loved, to abandoned and everything, to somebody that's just seeking revenge. And that's where Frankenstein ends up as well. Frankenstein ends up in the same place. He just seeks revenge because of all the pain that the creature has caused him. So I think it's this kind of it's just something where you see this come full circle throughout the novel, is that I feel sorry for the creature, because the creature is always just seeking for something, whereas Frankenstein is just running from something, running from his own personal responsibility. I also feel like Frankenstein was blinded quite a bit. He had this whole idea of creating almost a super race of creatures that, in some case, he was going to improve upon humanity. And that's kind of hubris in a sense, that, in a sense that he thought he was going to, I don't know. It just shows you the limitations of science to a certain degree. That's where part of it is that I was taking away from that. Yeah, so I guess that ambition and ego is one of those other things that I've already mentioned too many times, probably. But those are a couple of takeaways that I have as well. I find this to be interesting in one sense, is I think that a lot of our desires in general come from what we see people have, and essentially we just want what other people have. We don't necessarily know exactly what we want personally. So I think that's where exactly Frankenstein's the creature's desires actually come from witnessing what other people have, not necessarily coming to his own conclusion as to what he really wanted himself. So I think that's significant. Yeah, you muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Joe. There are several things that made me think about. I mean, one of the things is that when Frankenstein creates this creature, he's focused on creating this one individual. But the thing that is missing is that we are social solitary, that we are individuals and we are social beings. And being social is a core part of who we are. And if that is not satisfied, then you can't be fully functioning being. So that aspect he completely ignores, and then surprisingly finds it. The second point that you made is that the creature is seeking things, and it's a very difficult thing to seek, but the creature is doing its best, of saying, okay, what is it, what kind of thing is it, how can I get that, let me try to make some effort in trying to do that. And then so it is seeking to be loved, and when that does not happen, it is then that there is this switch to revenge. You also made a beautiful point about the contrast between the creature and Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is running away. You said he is running away from something, whereas creature is seeking something. That's very different. So the Frankenstein has the hubris, the pride, the ego of saying, okay, I'm going to do this, and I can do this, so I will do this, and then completely kind of defaulting on the responsibility of what he has done. And it's like, if you look at it as a parent, this is like abandoning your child, and worse than that, worse than abandoning your child. And once you see that, you can see how monstrous it is, an action it is, because the child doesn't have the ability to figure out how to fit into the society. And that is the job of the person who brought them into the world, to help with that. And that, if that is gone. So beautiful observation. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Doug, followed by Allison. Doug.
A couple of quick things. I mean, I think it is I did use the words tragedy and comedy, but in a way I meant the swings of happy and sad. So the happy mask, the sad mask, and then how do you find equanimity in that? And the romantics were not into equanimity. They were into explore the full range of the roller coaster, and as an expression of internal nature reflecting external nature, and the ups and downs of the mountains and valleys, and really that whole journey. There's also, I think CJ used the term Bildungsroman or Bildungsroman. I don't know how to pronounce it in German, but that coming of age novel, which I actually found a Wikipedia article that credits Goethe with kind of starting it, but the name wasn't applied until about 1819, which was a year after the first edition was published. And what we have here is a coming of age novel on top of a coming of age novel. There's the creator and young Frankenstein and how he develops, and then he creates this creature and he abandons the creature, and the creature has to, build himself through observation and I think using his senses in ways that the psychologists of the Enlightenment sort of pointed out. I mean, it's a very interesting sort of thing, and the monster, in a way, is a better builder than the creator, I think, in terms of these layered coming of age novels. The other thing is how pervasive hero worship was, and I think even Carlyle kind of codified the hero worship. And I like Roger Shattuck's interpretation in Forbidden Knowledge, where he compares Goethe's Faust with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and says she does a better job of, I mean, Goethe comes close to it, but she does a better job of seeing through the heroic male ego and how flawed it was. And he gives her a lot of credit that she leaps to a whole different perspective about these, and it's not that she disliked these heroic men, but she sort of saw through them. And I think she still perhaps even loved them, but I mean, she seemed devoted to her father, devoted to her husband. Lord Byron was in there, and I don't know the details of that, but it seems like she appreciates these people, but she definitely sees the flaws. And I don't think there's a lot of what we would think at that time was comedy, but there is some knowing smile or glance that she has in her prose or in her psychological perceptions that seems to be almost comic, certainly kind of witty at times. The other thing we did want to talk about that I wanted to throw out was the movies. We were in the last session going to say, okay, what did the movies do with this, and where did they get it right, and where did they get it
Please
wrong?
take your time. Go ahead.
And I'll just say a couple of things about that, which we've touched on before, but I think they're really important. Is that he sees his monster and runs away. All the Frankensteins in the movies, they hang around to see if he can walk, to see if he can talk. You know, they actually do run a few experiments. So in a way, they're better scientists in the movies. But that's missing the point of the novel altogether, that he's horrified by it and he can't look at his own creation, and he abandons it like a really flawed God who creates a torment rather than beauty and joy. And I mean, the other thing interesting, I think Mel Brooks, as I get older, I realize Mel Brooks was a bit of a genius in a lot of different ways. He actually produced The Elephant Man, which I think is an interesting variation on this. And he did Young Frankenstein, where Young Frankenstein actually takes so much care of the monster, he teaches him how to be a music hall star. You know, he becomes a stage mother to his creature, and actually teaches him how to sing and dance, and his monster finds love. So it seems like Young Frankenstein is actually that subversion of a happy ending, that CJ is asking about, if you paid attention to the monster and nurtured him. And Gene Wilder is very proud of what he's done, even though he doesn't understand it much. But he teaches him to sing and dance the way another dad would teach his kid how to play baseball or how to, football. He really nurtures him. And so, but boy, it's amazing how much the movies get wrong, both in Jekyll and Hyde and in this story, that there's something that in most of the movies, no matter how much they nurture him, or can he walk, can he talk, and they're paying attention to him, still he's evil and he goes bad. So that's a weird kind of flip that Hollywood does with it. And it seems like the monster has a lot of innate instincts for good, but none of that gets fed by any. And he keeps trying to forgive humanity and gives them one more chance until he says, this is a botched species, and I hate him, and I want to destroy him. So it's, anyway, that's sort of my final thoughts on the whole thing, the subversion of that male ego that leads to colonialism, that leads to this innate superiority, that we know what's going on, even though they're deeply incompetent.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. So I want to highlight two of the points here. One is that a great writer can actually show you a portrayal of what is going on inside a person. For example, you talked about, these heroic creators. She understands them and she appreciates them, but she understands the entire context of these people. What is it that they are focused on? What is it that they are missing? What is it that they are pushing away from their life? How is it that by focusing on this to an unusual degree, they are actually undercutting the rest of their life and undercutting people around them? Their fiance, the creature, and lots of society as a whole. I mean, they're undercutting a lot. But this rich portrayal is something a great literary person can do. And also it connects to the second point I want to make about the movies versus a novel. Now, in this novel, and this is actually true in many, many, many novels versus movies, movies tend to focus on the external spectacle. So they get all enamored and excited about the creature and what he can do, how he can move, how he can destroy things, but this internal drama, the inner monologue, inner process of the creature and the creator, that is kind of devalued, or it's not focused on. The spectacle moves outside. The inner spectacle is not fully covered. So those are the 2 points that stood out for me. Next up is Allison.
Yeah, I think the first time we read through this, I was really focused a lot on the creature and how everybody around him was treating him and ostracizing him because he's different. And that was kind of like the main thing that I thought at the first reading. But the second one is when I started really focusing more on Frankenstein and why he was making the decisions that he was making. And I think, I think like this whole thing of the ego, I mean, that's a really important part of it. But the other thing is, I feel like, like what Doug was saying about, and it's true, like that marriage is in some ways a death of who you were before, and you're becoming somebody that's different. And I think the biggest thing about it is that you have to, with both marriage and children, you have to put somebody else's needs ahead of your own. Before you do that, you can always think of yourself first. And the weird thing is that once you become that person, like it's a hard process. It's like you're like a butterfly or whatever, you go through this metamorphosis. And then after a while, you get so used to it, you don't notice it. And I was at the eye doctor yesterday and I decided to get new glasses. Now, I wear contacts. I almost rarely wear my glasses, but I do wear them like in the evenings at home. And the thing is, my prescription hasn't changed in forever. So the doctor was saying, well, when was the last time you had new glasses? She's like, it's not on your chart. And I really sat there and thought about it. And I realized it's been 15 years. 15 years, I've had the exact same pair of glasses. Even the prescription was the same, so I could see. It wasn't, but every single year of those 15 years, I bought my son new glasses. And I thought that's what the difference is, For 28 years, I either put my husband or my child ahead of me. And the thing is, and it never changes, because even though my child is an adult, he's always going to come first in my life. I may someday have grandchildren and I will 100% babysit them and do what, you literally become a different person because somebody else comes first. And it's not that they're always first. It's not that you can't ever care about yourself and your own things, but you're never the only person you consider. You're always considering yourself within a group and trying to find what works the best for the group. And I think that very decision is why there's so many of these books showing people having these dilemmas about it, because it is a monumental change, And I think also these books are written from this perspective of the men making the decision, because when the women had no way of supporting themselves, they could wrestle with it in their mind, but they knew they were going to get themselves married because they didn't want to be homeless in a ditch somewhere, But it's just, and it's very interesting in a way to think of like Dante, this book, and Faust, because they really are. It's all the same themes, similar themes, but they're acting in different sort of ways. And it really is like so often with these. But the part about the ego is, I think that a lot of people, they feel like they want to leave their mark on the world, and I think sometimes what is interesting is, especially when men are coming to the end of their life, how it's like, I remember talking to a neighbor who's like in his 70s about it. And he said, you just want one more ride on the merry-go-round, just one more ride on the merry-go-round. And then when I think about, like people running for office when they're in their 70s, or starting it's like they just want one more ride, and it all really, I mean, I read Don Quixote a couple of years ago, like maybe 2 years ago, and that really kind of stuck with me, this idea of like, why is he doing, like, you're gonna joust to win, why? But that line came back to me, just one more ride on the merry-go-round, and also the other connection is to the Old Man in the Sea. It's the same thing. The man's coming to the end of his life, but he's gonna, by God, he's gonna get that whale, and I guess you reach that point where you're always trying to accomplish things, like when are you done? And you don't ever want to be done. You always want to contribute, but at what point, what I think is interesting is how some people can channel that in different directions and some don't, like it's interesting to look at retired presidents, and it's interesting to see the choices that they make about what they're going to do, and some of them are going to go build houses for humanity, and some of them are going to start foundations. They find different ways to contribute, but then there are some, they never can adjust to losing that power, they never quite, and you can see it. And I'm not talking about one person in particular. I think there are many where they're never quite over the fact that they're not the center of attention anymore. And others are fine with it. They're just like, all right, I'm just gonna go build this little house here, even though I'm 95, But others are like, they wrestle with it. They miss. And I remember actually watching a movie about Nixon, and he, was gone. He was in California, and they interviewed him, and he was saying something about, oh, you have this beautiful house on the ocean, and why aren't you happy? And he just said, because Washington is where the power is. Washington. And it was like that wanted one last and they're like, you're done. He's like, I know that, but
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Alison. Just so many amazing observations. I love the line, just one more ride. I think that is very good, because what happens is that people get attached to that and they don't want to lose the glory. And they're kind of looking at the past. Actually, the time has passed. They may
Right.
not be actually able to actually ride on the thing anymore.
Right. Yeah, they might fall off it.
Yeah, but still,
Yeah.
that's all that they have.
Right.
And I'm really curious about this, especially the comparison between Faust and Frankenstein. So if anybody at some point wants to talk about it, because we are going through Faust on the every other alternate one, and it's a very deep theme in Faust in some ways. So which is going to be very interesting to compare those two. So that is definitely. I also want to make a point here that you brought up. I don't know what to say about it and how to say it, but you talked about that you've taught many children who are being raised by, single mothers. And in some ways, there is that abandonment there, and it has real consequences. And so I just thought it's kind of similar of saying, somebody who does that and says, okay, now it's not my job. No, I'm gone, and it does have tremendous impact.
Sometimes I feel like, I see firsthand what the consequences are within, I'm a single mother, so I've seen it within my own family. But as a teacher, I don't think people realize how much these kids go to school and talk about it. And they talk about it loudly, they cry, they throw fits, they're hysterical. And sometimes they're like that 10 years after the fathers abandoned them. They don't really get over it. I mean, they really don't. They carry it within them. And I think sometimes it makes people stronger. I mean, we've had a number of presidents who were raised by single mothers. So they took all of that and they became super accomplished because they just took all of the emotions and channeled it. But to act like it's just nothing and they just go on about their day, it's not. it's something that they live with forever. And so I can't even understand. It's so unfathomable to walk away from a child. It's just like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's kind of like I don't know what Mars is like, you know what I mean? It's like the same thing. Like I can't even wrap my brain around it. But it happens all the time.
Yes.
All the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Next up is Doug, Ed, and Joe. Doug.
Well, I found it interesting that you said you were drawn more to Dostoevsky, because in Dostoevsky, the men have these great ideas and they end up, shipwrecked against the rocks of life. And usually it's a woman who brings them back in some way. And I think a lot of these writers, even Dickens, who was very flawed, but in a way he had a lot of self-knowledge. He knew he kind of ruined his family and mistreated his wife. And it may even be why he kept performing so much at the end of his life, because he would get love from the people and he'd really failed his family. He was very conscious of that. But that's 50 years later than this. And that's a whole nother topic to go into. But these men, if we're finally seeing how many of these great men had muses that actually did a lot of their work. There's a new book out on Einstein's wife as a mathematician and her possible involvement in his most major theories. And it's just interesting. I had a mother who was a straight A pre-med student at UC Berkeley who quit school to put my dad through law school. And I always thought that was a sacrifice she made. And later I found a 10-page letter from my dad when he was 19 years old in the Navy back to my mother saying, "You got me to do some very powerful thinking when you asked me, now you're getting married, what are you going to do with your life?" And then my dad said, "Oh, maybe I'll be a lawyer." And he kind of called the whole, like Babe Ruth, pointing at the outfield field. And I never realized that was kind of my mother's plan, even though it kind of cursed her in a way. And I don't think she was very happy making that sacrifice, but that's how we're acculturated, that it was like, she's the one and said, "I'm marrying you. What are you going to do with your life?" And she was working for Shell Oil in high school during World War II, making more money than her father did working for the IRS in San Francisco. She was pulled out of high school to monitor fuel mixtures. And I'm not sure our whole family ever recovered from that sacrifice, but then only at the end of my father's life, this letter appeared, and then I realized my mother was the strongest person in the family, and she never felt that. But she was, in some ways, the most powerful. She had an incredible mathematical, scientific mind, and then later she found some happiness in LA, where she actually kind of worked. She went through a very difficult, long, extended menopause. And when she came out of it, she began to consult other women about going through that. And in a way, she became a doctor for a period of time. And then they all moved to Salt Lake City because my dad was going to teach law in the law school. She'd just gotten to like LA, after 20 years in LA. And then she formed a book group of Mormon women reading Flaubert, Dostoevsky, Jane Austen, all these incredible books, Madame Bovary's Sophocles, Antigone, and Doll's House, Ibsen's. I mean, this was like a Mormon reading group. And so she kept recreating an intellectual life. She got an accounting degree in her 60s. So the sacrifices, or the way women have been taken for granted, I really kind of grew up with that. And how they often collaborate with it. And that was astonishing. And then I was with one woman for years, and I helped raise her daughter, and I still have a good relationship with her daughter. But she went to visit our family, and my dad was gregarious, very funny. And she went away, and she said a couple of interesting things, but she said, "Your mother is really funny, but your dad is so overtly funny. Nobody notices how funny your mother is." No. And I began to pay more attention. And I always knew my mother was funny. She could be fun and funny, but I didn't, it's weird. But the other thing is the alchemical marriage thing, and that the marriage and walking away from a marriage or a child, it's like walking away from what Jung would call the crucible that actually forces you to figure out who you are in conjunction with somebody else. And I think that's part of all of these writers. But the Frankenstein character, Victor, is like knows a lot about the alchemical traditions, but he certainly doesn't come up with that Jungian concept of learning who he is. I mean, he has very little self-knowledge, it seems. A lot of aspirations that he's very ambivalent about. These ambitions are great. No, they're terrible. They're, you know, even Walton sort of, there are all these things about don't be ambitious, but then Walton returns going, oh, my heart is broken because I can't be the heroic person because my crew doesn't have the courage to do what I want to do. I mean, the lack of knowledge of some of these men is humbling. Dostoevsky does that too. You go, these guys are nuts. They're Dostoevsky, just like his portrait of artists in The Possessed is like made me rethink every party I've ever been at. It's like once you had a few drinks, the pontificating of artists. And
Wonderful.
anyway,
Thank you.
some personal notes there, but
Thank you, Doug. So Doug and Allison, one thing that you made me think is that the problem here is that the creature doesn't have a mother. And the creator there can't.
Or a father.
No, but what I'm saying is this.
Yeah.
What I'm
No,
saying is this, that throughout history, no matter what role the kind of externally viewed role mothers have, women have played, the role that women have played throughout history of raising children and providing them the context to do that, to actually become human beings. That is something profound. That is something profound. And that is what is missing here. That this creature doesn't have a being like that who cares so much about the creature that they will make whatever sacrifice needed to set them up right for life. And no matter what positions, because the thing is, you can't have, this species has male and female. And we can't have men, successful men, without women, without mothers who provide that nurturing. And in one way, what we are seeing here is that Frankenstein has none of those. He doesn't have those characteristics that are needed to actually create that. So I just wanted to, make that point. A beautiful point, Doug and Allison. Next up is Ed, Joe, and Madeline. Ed.
Yeah, just to comment on Allison's mention that she couldn't see how someone could abandon a child. I can say from personal experience, it's more than that. A mother can be so childish, selfish, and vindictive that she does more damage staying than she does going. So in Frankenstein's case, it was a choice that he had to actively work to create this being. For humans, it's often accidental. That's the way the biology works. However, to Allison's point, being a parent is a choice. In the way that we do it in our society, it is indeed putting your child's interests ahead of your own and choosing to do it again and again and again, day after day. And that is certainly something that this creature got absolutely nothing of. And it's not too surprising that he would turn out badly because I commented in the text that the creature is very human. So I'm not going to go into too much more than that. Just
Wonderful.
struck a chord with me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Great observation. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Madeline, and Allison. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to one of the things that you had asked about is that I find that parallels between Faust and Victor Frankenstein, and that is the pursuit of knowledge, right? And the pursuit of knowledge so far is that they are only pursuing knowledge for their own personal gratification, and that's fine, but they're also not caring about the consequences of their actions in that process. And what they'll do anything in order to achieve a certain degree of knowledge, and that's what's dangerous. And it's interesting because you think of things like we've studied obviously the Bhagavad Gita, and you think of things like Jnana Yoga, and pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowing oneself to prevent yourself from actually hurting others and hurting yourself in the process, so you can act in the world wisely, interact with others. And these are two separate pursuits that are going on. And one is seeking only the pursuit for their own personal gratification, and they're only seeking it, and they'll do it by any means. And they're no different than an individual that's seeking money or some material possession or whatever it is, by any means necessary. They are going to get what they want, and to hell with the consequences. And there's the other end of it. There you can, the pursuit of knowledge is actually a virtue, but it's a virtue in the sense that you're thinking about how it relates to the whole. And I think that contrast is something that both Goethe and Mary Shelley are kind of warning us about, is that to be wary of yes, and specifically our advances in science at this particular moment in time too, with Mary Shelley, that how we should pursue science, how we should look at nature. Those are really important messages, but that's, I think, is the link between Faust and Victor Frankenstein, is that it's the way they pursue knowledge and why they pursue knowledge, and the reckless nature by which they do it. And so anyway.
Wonderful. Great point. I mean, you talked about Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
So let us contrast between the knowledge, the jnana in Bhagavad Gita,
Yeah.
or even, the wisdom in the Greek tradition, or wisdom of the sage in Tao Te Ching. So all of these on one hand, and the kind of knowledge, mostly power, knowledge/power, that is being portrayed here in Frankenstein. The knowledge, it's really I think better word is wisdom, because it is about knowing yourself, knowing the universe, including everybody, and knowing what is the right thing to do. It's a moral issue.
Mhm.
Wisdom is moral. It's saying, what is the moral right thing to do given the deepest nature of you, the universe, and everyone else? What is that? The practice of doing that, knowing it so that you can act that way. That is what knowledge in this axial tradition, axial age tradition of both, of the Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, or the Bible, that's what it is about. The knowledge in the modern age is disintegrated knowledge. It is knowledge about how not the knowledge of why, but knowledge of how. It's not knowledge of the meaning of what you're doing, the purpose of what you're doing, but it is about how to do things. It is about being able to manipulate certain particular things. And that is typically thought of as being disconnected from everything else. So the consequences of that knowledge and the power that results from it are never fully accounted for. And people just go and do that. And so in a sense, the modern world is fragmented, disintegrated, not integrated. So that's the difference that I see. The great observation. Let's see. Next up is going to be Madeline, followed by Allison. Madeline.
Yes, let's see. Well, I'm still back on the discussion of gender.
Yes.
I think that there have been many interesting themes running through our discussions over the course of this book, and that's one of them. If you said to someone, the writer Shelley, they would probably think of Percy Shelley. You would specify Mary Shelley. And there's a reason for that, which is that after his death, she really devoted herself to promoting his poetry. It doesn't sound to me as if Byron was going to do it. It doesn't sound to me as if Percy Shelley's father was going to do it. It really would just probably be languishing around had it not been for her. And the mention of Einstein's wife, I hadn't known that. But I do know about the very successful novelist, John le Carré, is his pen name. And at some point after his death, which was quite recent, I read an article by one of his sons who said that, his father certainly acknowledged that he showed his wife his manuscripts, but he said really she was functionally almost a co-author. She spent so much time with the restructuring and developing the ideas and the plot lines from the very early stages. So, how on earth does this happen? I would say part of it is gender essentialism, which is the idea that whatever gender you are born with or into, however you think of it, there are certain intrinsic qualities to that you as a human being are going to have. So if you are a woman, the things that you say or the things that you write, those are really the voice of the passive, the voice of the night, the voice of the unconscious, the voice of the fertile field that has yet to be developed by seed. And so naturally, it is the conscious mind, the logos, the bright sunlight, the male, that properly gives it voice. I think that probably most women have had the experience of saying something and having it ignored in a group of people. Then, like, literally less than 60 seconds later, a man will say the exact same thing and everyone go, oh yeah, wow. And I think that really that stems from gender essentialism. I think a lot of the time it isn't even conscious. People really just don't hear it because the background noise of the people who raise the children is going to kind of always be there, doing the caretaking, getting the groceries, all that sort of thing. Kind of the fertile ground. And that it would take people in some other role to bring the ideas forward. So I think that, in our discussions about gender and parenthood in this book, this topic has come up a lot, especially in that interesting conversation we had about what would it have been like if Victor had said, okay, I am a parent now. Why don't I take responsibility? Why don't I take this creature home and, introduce him to my family and my fiance and the villagers and everything, and try to integrate him into the world and actually be the parent that he's asking me to be. So anyway, that was one of the big themes of the novel, I thought, were gender roles and parenting, and but the life of a solitary creator. Again, I think that Victor, he is much more like an artist than he is like any scientist I've ever known. They're just, in general, they're just not like that. The lab people, at least, they're really not. Yeah, so that was it. The voice of the unconscious speaking.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's a question of, I think, a ground and figure. Across history, I think the power behind the throne, there's always been women who have been really, really powerful, but they are in the background. So so the background and foreground is a very, very deep theme that runs, and it's a very real and powerful thing, because we are creatures which are, got very large subconscious or unconscious, and what we are conscious of is relatively limited. So there is influence of that, and there is that there is that play. So beautiful point. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Allison, Doug, and Ed. Allison.
Well, I think the thing to remember about this is that these roles are changing.
Yes.
My father was a journalist, and he worked for some extremely prestigious newspapers and had a very, very high level position. And so sometimes I've talked to people who want to be journalists, and they're like, how did he get to that point? Well, he got to that point because he moved from little paper to bigger paper to bigger paper to bigger paper, And my parents met in grad school. My mom always worked, but she followed his career. And, at one point he worked nights. So she mostly raised us, while he was doing it. And she, always supported him. But that was that era. The thing is, nowadays, when I look outside my front door and I look at my neighbors across the street who are probably 15 years younger than me, 20 years younger than me, and I watch this one father, the things that he does with his children, he plays with the children. I mean, he's a phenomenal dad, phenomenal husband, takes on, his wife works, and it's a much more balanced way where they're each balancing each other. So the thing to remember about, these books is that these are written a long time ago, and it's interesting to see how the things are changing, but things are changing even, in the last 20 years. And so it's not just, this thing anymore where the women are in the background helping so the men can shine. The women are shining. You look at women in Congress, we have a female vice president, and she's a phenomenally supportive husband. So it's changing. And I think, and I've known fathers who were house husband, and their wife is the one who made all the money. But it is kind of an interesting thing. I feel like as I go back and I look at these books, and I think so much is universal, but I always kind of think, well, what has changed? What has changed? What's different? What's better? Are we evolving as humans at all? And a big thing that I see that's changed from these books, these classics to now, you see that the role of women changing, but you see also the role, many cases of democracy changing. Many of these books were written, with kings, queens, czars, whatever, and as the books, one of the things that I always liked about Dostoevsky, because there's so much politics in there and the role of it, and within the novel, you're understanding these changes that happened, they happened in Russia, and then they happened in so many other parts of the world. So I think that's what's interesting about these books, is to realize what is universal, but also what has changed, and how are we a better planet now than we were 100 years ago? Because people worked really hard to make things better and more equitable, not just between genders, but between, economically, and in so many ways. In so many ways, I feel like we are a much more equal society today than we were 100 years ago, and certainly 300 years ago.
Excellent point, Allison. I want to add to that. I mean, part of it is that we're looking at these books which were written way back. And things definitely have changed. But the other point, in addition to that, is that there is so much individual variation amongst individuals, both male and female, and tremendous variation in families and the roles that are played within. So the individual variation is just incredibly large. So all of that is the context. So great points. Thank you. Next up is Doug, followed by Ed. Doug.
I have basically, a couple of ideas that are maybe worth exploring, because at the top of this, you said we might go back to exploring Bucky, which I
Yes.
think would be interesting to go back to him after Dante, after, Dostoevsky, Saramago, the Goethe, Mary Shelley. Because Bucky had it's a short essay. I mean, it was in Saturday Night Review of Literature, I think, where he talked about the original engineers were probably women. And, it's where he writes about the goddess, and he writes about, even though there are books coming out now that I don't think fully understand who Bucky was and the role he played, it's like they're pot-shotting at certain flaws, and he was flawed and he did strange things, but he definitely thought that the men went out on hunts, or this is how I think of it. The men on hunts, or they went to war and they got killed, and the woman had to go on running life, and she had to figure out how to fix things and do things. And the men would come back, get drunk, tell war stories, and they're fixing, but they're there looking at the objects of life every day. And out of that stillness and meditation, they create things, and that their rhythms are more creative than the men. Now, the men may end up coming back and going, that's great, and then tell his friends he invented it. I don't know, maybe we've been dealing with this forever, but it's like, and I think that sort of credit thing maybe is, because men are really, it's an interesting thing now that women are faced to deal, I don't think realize how men have to deal with these pecking orders from, being babies all the way through school, and they find their place in the pecking order. And I think women are seeing this pecking order and they're going, I don't like that. I don't believe in that. And that's healthy, because the hazing that comes out of these pecking orders and the bullying that comes out of the pecking orders, men have been used to this for thousands of years. And I think women have sort of watched it and sort of found ways to sort of play around with. I mean, it's an interesting sort of thing, but Bucky's essay might be an interesting place to start after reading these books and seeing this emergence of feminine energy from the Romantics, Enlightenment, to the Romantics, to the modern world. Might be interesting to look at that, and there are other things to do. The other thing I do, and it's something I got from a woman scholar, Marianne MacDonald, who I think was one of the people who inherited the Zenith fortune, Zenith TV. And she was a classical scholar. And we were writing an adaptation of the Oedipus trilogy into TV talk shows. We did the whole thing. And we went to talk to her, and she started, because we've been throwing around ambition a lot in this. And we talked to her, and she said, ambition, that's sort of, what's the Greek word for it? I'm just blanking right now. She said that it was that created the tragic flaw and it destroyed the hero. She said it was very different in Greek times.
Hubris.
Hubris, yeah, that hubris was an essential virtue that made you do something that really helped your society, and it would destroy you in the process because you were putting yourself out there to find the truth, like Oedipus. And he sacrifices all of his kingly power to find the truth of who murdered this man. And it turns out it was him, and that the man he murdered was his father. But he pursues that, even with his mother saying, don't go there. She figures it out before he does and says, don't go there. And he goes there, no matter what it costs to him. And so that's an ambition that says, I'm going to find the truth here. And he cures the plague by sort of purging the blood that's been buried out in the ground, begging for the truth to come out. So that's an interesting thing to throw in the mix here of how ambition may be an essential quality even when it destroys the hero, you know. And this is a woman who was telling me this brilliant, you know, she was very close friends with Athol Fugard, the South African playwright, as well, and she helped fund a lot of the experimental theaters in San Diego. And, so,
thank you, Doug. Next up is going to be Ed, followed by Marilyn. Ed.
Okay, yeah, so a couple of things I heard that I'm going to react to. I'll start with the term gender essentialism. I would say that it is essential that we acknowledge the indelible biological differences between men and women, and it is wrong to use those to limit the opportunities of any individual. So if we're looking at the evidence for it, we can go as simple as you've got ridiculous amounts of video now. You can see 15-year-old boys soccer team beating up on the Australian women's national team. It's like in sporting and one-on-one combat competition, it's no contest. It's a real fundamental difference. Very successful woman who I know and respect very highly noted that she and her friends were so incredibly surprised by the way they fell in love with their children, whether they be natural or adopted, in a way that men don't necessarily do. So it is great that we are pushing the marker further toward a more equitable distribution, if you will, of effort in the home. Will we get to 50-50? Maybe. The tendencies will be interesting. You also have the evidence that in cultures that are more gender equal in terms of opportunity, you get more gender-specific segregation in terms of choices. That says we're not talking about an acculturated thing. We're talking about something intrinsic, that when men and women get to choose what feels good to them, they choose in stereotypical ways. So this thing exists and we need to account for it.
Thank you. Great point. Ed, let's get back to Frankenstein. And that's the topic. So let's get back to that. Madeline, go ahead.
Well, thanks, Ed. It's too bad that we can't visit all the alternate universes where at every decision point in human history, things split off into another multiverse, and we could go and see how things turned out in all the different ones. I was thinking the discussion of the pecking order made me think of class issues and how they play out in Frankenstein, and also how they play out, at least in the first part of Faust, which of course also has a lot of gender issues in it. And the similarities between the protagonists of both books. In Faust's case, he's reaching to the spirit world. He's trying something new and different. He initiates the compact with Mephistopheles, with the devil. He's the one who wants to make a bargain and who sets the terms. And it's the same thing in this. Frankenstein is the one who reaches out. He reaches out to make something new in this case. But in both cases, they are really kind of shielded by money in terms of what their choices are in life and things they can do. Even when Frankenstein's little boat takes him across to Ireland and he sees the nice little village, he thinks, well, but fortunately I had money in my pocket. So for both of these men, the pecking order is very much alive and well. I think in the case of Frankenstein, especially, he's very, very class conscious. And everyone is kind of behaves according to their station. The only real surprise is the purity and nobility of Justine. But other than that, everyone kind of fits right into their slot. And it's the same thing with Faust. And so we have these two men, these two protagonists, who are these romantics who follow their feelings in these very stable and role-oriented societies in terms of class. And I did notice in Frankenstein that Shelley uses, that would be Mary Shelley, Shelley uses a lot of feeling words. The wind is violent, it's heavy, and then, you know, Frankenstein himself, of course, is always going on and on about his feelings. And in a way that's not done in our current writing these days. Usually the prescription is to show, don't tell. And it's usually done by describing actions or by describing the surroundings or the landscape. But we do have apparently about 2%. I'm just going to go off topic for like 15 seconds. We do have about 2% of the population has aphantasia, which means that they don't do mental visualization. I'm in the 98% who thinks like, but how do they think of anything? They don't. They're perfectly fine. They're function in society. A lot of them are very smart. I don't know about the others. But so I read an interesting article recently by someone with aphantasia who said, I need to have feeling words in the things that I'm reading. It's not enough to say, you know, the cold wind howled around me and bashed at my cheeks as I climbed the bitter dark mountain. I also need the author to say, you know, and I felt alone and abandoned by the world. And so even though it's not the style right now, because that the reader doesn't form a mental picture in their mind of what the mountain is and everything. They're really going by conversational cues and by feeling words or thoughts or logic. So even though what Shelley did in this book is really out of fashion now, that may be one of the reasons for its enduring popularity.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Allison. Joe.
So, you know, I'm trying to weave this out and through my head right now. It's, I guess one good question, or you know, I think we've all been answering it in one way or the other, is that why does it fail? You know, why does Frankenstein, the project itself, fail? And we've been talking about that in one way or another. And one thing that I'm thinking is that it fails primarily, obviously, because Frankenstein's abandonment of the creature, but also the barbarous acts of the villagers and everyone else involved as well. It's a complete rejection of society. And the reason I only think that that is interesting is that in Faust, one of the things that Mephistopheles says is that we're more bestially than the other beasts have ever been, in the sense that our reason sometimes and our reaction sometimes, and reason enabled Frankenstein to create Faust to begin with. I mean, wait a minute. To create the creature to begin with. It was his reasoning capability. But then the pure rejection of him, nature would never project their own child or something along that. They would never create their own child, but they would never reject their own child. And I think there's a somewhat of a connection there where I think that sometimes our ability to the ability to create something has led to our rejection of it. That's the connection that I'm trying to make. Our reason, literally allowed us to create this creature, and then we rejected it, and we acted more bestially than if we, because of our reason in this particular instance. And that's what he says. And when Mephistopheles and God have initially talking about Faust in heaven, or human beings in heaven. I wish I had actually the exact phrase here where they say that. But essentially, that's one of the points that is made. So I just think that that's an interesting parallel, because what I think that Mary Shelley is talking about here too is what happens is when we go against nature, and as well. So that's just a thought.
Thank you. I want to contrast Frankenstein to characters which are very unusual, outsider characters in Victor Hugo. Hunchback of Notre Dame, Man Who Laughs, Toilers of the Sea, all of these have characters which are very odd and which are outside of society, and still manage to have the inner grandeur, and they never lose it. So it's a contrast between that. So if you want to look at that. Next up is going to be Allison, followed by Madeline. Allison.
Yeah, I was thinking a while back we did these meetups on breadth versus depth, and which one really helps you to become the best at something. And you need both, but there's a point, if you're going to become really good at something, you need depth. You need to go really in depth with something. And it seems to me that the mistake that both Frankenstein and Faust are making is they're just going for breadth. They're not going for depth. And they want to accomplish things, they want to learn, but they're not going deeply enough. Like Frankenstein, when he creates a creature, he could create more creatures, try to learn more about it, really go in depth to really, really understand what he's done, and really try to do the best that he can. But instead, he's like, oh, I made this thing, now I'm going to go take the grand tour of Europe, and then I think it's time to go to Ireland. And then he's just flitting around all over the place, and he's not getting any really, forget the whole domestic thing. Even if he doesn't want that, fine, then get really good at this one thing you're trying to do, but he can't even do that right, And then the same thing with Faust, and I haven't started, book 2 yet, but at least so far, it seems like he just wants all these experiences, and he, again, flitting around, not really, getting really good at anything, or really going in depth to really, really learn something well. And so it's a problem that they both share in a way.
It's a great observation. Thank you. Because when you're going deep, I love Bucky's take on this, macro comprehensive and micro incisive. Like when you are going to do micro incisive, that means you're taking full responsibility for the point that you're focusing on. And actually, in order to do that, you have to be macro comprehensive, in the sense that you have to bring in all the relevant things. You have to bring in entire context, the psychological, social, individual, everything together on that one point. It's like, to me, it's like a funnel. You're what you can bring in on one point depends on how much breadth you have taken in, and then your commitment and your responsibility of taking responsibility for that one thing that you're doing. So a beautiful point. Thank you. Next up is Madeline.
Well, I was thinking about the theme of Victor Frankenstein, the man who lies and lies and lies, never keeps his promises, doesn't tell people what's going on with him, lies some more, lies some more. Basically, pretty much the opposite of Kant with his categorical imperative. And I was thinking about Dante and the circle of hell that is for frauds and counterfeiters.
Hmm.
And I think in it, I forget what their punishment was, if someone remembers. But it seems to me that Victor Frankenstein was, in a sense, a counterfeiter. In other words, he created life from parts. He created something that was counterfeit. And he was also a fraud in the sense that he went along pretending to be normal and let everyone else take the blame for things as he went along. So I think he was a fraud and a counterfeiter. So I'm just wondering, is there anything in Dante about the punishment for them that might be related to Victor's eventual fate? Does anyone remember?
Ah,
I remember the punishment, but I mean, but it was more money lenders, and it was just basically that they were always greedy and protecting the money that they had, if I remember correctly. Like, essentially they wouldn't let Dante reach for his, like, reach for any of the coins. I remember briefly. I forget what the exact punishment is. Maybe they're always desiring or needing.
I think they were a different category. I think the weren't the frauds and counterfeiters, weren't they the worst? I mean, worse than murderers? Didn't we get that?
Well, you're maybe where the realm where Brutus is. The betrayers.
I
maybe
can't remember, and
I'm gonna have to look at it.
right now the
to-
books are holding up my laptop, so I can't get at them.
okay.
What became clear was that the deepest sins were sins of language, which is interesting because it's written by a poet, and that to kill somebody is one thing, but an animal can kill somebody, and that's a relatively mild sin. To create an illusion of a reality or to convince somebody through words to persuade them to kill somebody else, that was a much deeper sin. Yeah, so that kind, and fraud was also very deep down, where you kind of stealing something is, an animal can steal food from another animal. But actually creating a situation where you convince other people to create a systemic fraud were the deepest sins. Yeah, I'm trying to look it up and I can't find it myself. But
Thank you.
Oh yeah, I think convincing someone else to commit fraud would actually be, yeah, I can see that.
and those were the deepest sins, and that came from that chart that Phil did, where you could look at it and go, "Oh my gosh, all of these are sins of, where language is misused, not to express the truth, but to express a lie that creates havoc."
Wonderful. So I want to point out, I think, three things. Number one, I have put a whole bunch of links to videos in the chat. Please go ahead and copy those. These are the videos that we are planning to discuss. CJ was planning to discuss. We're not going to do the next two review sessions, but these are selections of videos that CJ had chosen for these events. So you can go ahead and copy, and you can use, please go ahead and look them up. So that's point number one. Point number two, Faust. We have a series on Faust going on every other week, and Phil is leading it, and it's an incredible series. So please, I'm sure most of you are already participating in it. So that's one. But I also want to tell you that we have a really special meetup on Dante coming up, and that is going to be on Wednesday the 30th. Wednesday the 30th. Phil is going to be back, and he will be discussing Orbach on Dante. It is a very profound topic. Phil did a meetup on Eric Orbach, and he talked about the difference between the classical style of Homer in Odyssey, distinguishing that from the biblical style in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The classical style being just this amazing way of illuminating everything. So you know everything that is going on in the minds of people. They talk it out. You know everything. Everything is illuminated. Everything is in the foreground. Everything is the figure. Versus Old Testament or New Testament style, where so little of the actual concretes are given, but those are very well chosen to point to this massive ground which is behind it. And what Dante does is that he brings both these things together in his work. He's master of both, and he somehow makes it work. So that's what a great artist does. So this is actually epistemology of literature. And that is the level at which Orbach does, deals with it. And that's what we're going to do. And that's going to be on Wednesday, the 30th. What's that? Doug, you were asking something.
I'm sorry. Wednesday of November, 30th of November?
That's right. November 30th. November 30th. That's
what time is it?
9 p.m. Eastern time.
Oh, okay.
All our weekday meetups are at that time.
Okay.
All right. So I also want to tell you that we are launching a series on Buckminster Fuller. That's going to be very special. That's going to be Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern time. If you have not participated in our poetry meetups, collaborative poetry meetups, we do that on Mondays. This is on 52 Living Ideas, the meetup 52 Living Ideas. So you're welcome to join. Maritza does a fantastic job of leading that meetup where people get together in smaller groups and we do poetry. I think the topic this time is going to be on being right. And the featured poet is Maya Angelou. This Wednesday, we are going to do a meetup on one of CJ's meetups. CJ did a meetup on 16 intellectual virtues, where, of course, one of them is the breadth and the depth, but there are 16 of them that he has identified. And we're going to look at the video that he has, essay that he has, and we're going to discuss those 16 intellectual or epistemic virtues. So thank you very much, everybody. Joe, would you like to add anything before we leave?
No, I just want to thank everybody, and especially, CJ unfortunately couldn't join us for this last session, but I very much appreciate all the effort that he had put in through all the sessions, reading this twice, bringing us through this, in addition to, keeping up with his Wednesday commitments during this time period. So I'm very grateful for everybody's insights, and for him leading this, and for everybody on this particular call. I think has been there pretty much the whole time. I've been here when I could be, but I'm grateful to everyone, and I thought it was a very good experience.
Thank you. I mean, today was a small group, but I thought it worked out really well. Doug and Ed. Doug.
Yeah, I wanted to say it's been a real pleasure through this leapfrogging through various books to get to know Joe and Allison and Madeline. I think the counterpoint of ideas has been really fruitful for me, and I thank all of you. And Ed, you're, I think, a new face to me. Or are you relatively new? Yeah.
Yes.
But it's been pretty fascinating journey through these different authors with some of you on some meetings and some of you not. But thank you.
No, that I just want to say one thing about that. It is very special. I mean, what we have here in 52 Living Ideas or Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society is that all these individuals, bring their various different experiences, viewpoints, thoughts, and we openly share them, both the commonalities and differences. And we are doing that on work after work after work. And what it does is that it really shows you the richness of the work, because you can grasp only some things from your point of view. And this is a way of expanding that dramatically. So I really, really appreciate that. Ed, you had a point.
Yeah, just thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm a bit of a gadfly popping in here. It came up on my feed. It looked interesting. I admit I have not read 2 copies of Frankenstein, and it's been years since I read Frankenstein. And the perspective of it being a form of parenting and tying it into these other ideas was an interesting twist that kind of triggered some things that I've been looking into. So thank you ever so much. This was pleasant. I enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Shrikant. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.